Travel Show, your essential guide wherever you're heading, every weekend on BBC World News.
This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. President Trump says he's prepared for his meeting with Kim Jong-un. If all goes well, the North Korean leader could get an invite to the White House.
I really believe that we have the potential to do something incredible for the world, and it's my honor to be involved.
But first, the US president's off to Quebec, where protests like these shows a greeting at the G7 summit could prove a bit chilly. And we're just a week away from the World Cup, but in some Russian cities, the welcome signs come with a feeling that someone's watching. Welcome to World News America. With just a few days to go, President Trump says he is ready for his meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. His comments came as he welcomed Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to the White House. A short time later, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he received a personal assurance from Mr. Kim that his country is ready to denuclearize. But the interpretation of that term is bound to be a key topic in Singapore. The BBC's Jane O'Brien begins our coverage.
With the clock ticking down to Tuesday's summit with Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump was visibly excited.
I think it's going to be a very fruitful meeting. I think it's going to be an exciting meeting. I think we're going to get to know a lot of people that our country never got to know.
So the summit now seems to be more of a getting-to-know-you session rather than a complex and high-stakes negotiation. Another insight into Mr. Trump's rather unorthodox approach.
I don't think I have to prepare very much. It's about attitude. It's about willingness to get things done. But I think I've been preparing for this summit for a long time.
That's in contrast to the rather more direct approach taken by the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when asked if both sides were closer to agreeing on a definition of denuclearization.
Yes.
Can you describe that a little bit?
No.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Japan.
But for Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe here in Washington to ensure his voice is heard, the direct threat from North Korea remains. These drills are a practice for the ballistic missiles that can already reach Tokyo, with or without nuclear warheads. But Mr. Abe seems to have been sidelined. Kim has met with China's President Xi, South Korea's President Moon, and Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Trump, meanwhile, is already thinking of other photo ops with Mr. Kim.
Sir, if you do invite him to the United States, would it be here at the White House or at Mar-a-Lago?
Maybe we'll start with the White House. What do you think?
Mr. Abe has invested a lot of time building a personal relationship with Mr. Trump. But as other leaders of US allies have discovered to their cost, friendship doesn't always come with benefits. And with Mr. Trump so keen for his own success, Mr. Abe might be right to worry. Jane O'Brien, BBC News, Washington.
And a brief time ago, I discussed today's meeting with Mary Jordan, a correspondent for The Washington Post, who was previously based in Tokyo. Mary Jordan, good to have you with us. We've seen the Japanese Prime Minister in Washington today. How important is it, as we approach this summit in Singapore, for President Trump to make sure he has all the regional allies on side?
Well, I think it's just as important to the Japanese, which, I think that Abe came here with high hopes that he's not forgotten by Donald Trump. After all, Donald Trump is the America First president. And even though he's making noises and reaching out to Abe, who he has been in touch with, many people here at the State Department and career foreign service officers are actually wondering, when he is sitting down with the North Korean leader, is he going to remember that there's other actors in the region that have a lot at stake here?
And for Japan, it's all about the abducted prisoners. But how seriously do you think President Trump will take that as a condition as he goes into talks with North Korea?
That's a big question. You know, he has a good relationship with Abe, who has been to Mar-a-Lago and came here again today. It was a very important visit. And after all, you know, Japan is in the region. If we're talking about nuclear weapons, there's a lot more than the abductees at stake, though we cannot diminish. I lived in Japan for several years, and the emotional, I mean, if this really happens, that the North Koreans who were abducted, especially this 13-year-old girl who has been gone since 1977, if that girl is released and returned to Japan, I think Donald Trump would be a hero over there. So I think Donald Trump knows that and wants to do that because he wants to have this legacy.
And of course, this summit all comes down to Donald Trump being able to come away with some sort of agreement on denuclearization. But today in the Rose Garden, he says he's prepared to walk away from this if it doesn't go well. What do you think are the odds of that happening?
Well, first of all, that's Donald Trump's negotiating style. He's written books about that. He's a businessman. You know, you can't really have you can't be a good negotiator unless you can walk away from the table. But it was very interesting that he just said in the press conference today that I'm going to solve this. And, you know, he kind of mocked people in the past. He said it's not just Obama that blew it, but other presidents. You know, it's a terrible shame that they let it fester like this, and I'm going to solve this. So he's really put the gauntlet down and basically said that he's going to get something out of the summit. Now, most people think that this could be a drawn-out process, and you know, it's not going to be magic that appears in one day in Singapore. And he did say that if it goes well there, he's going to invite him to the White House. Now, if the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, arrives in the White House, that is going to be quite a moment. And a big deal for the North Korean leader, too, who, you know, this is what he wants, stature. And he would have gotten it if he gives enough in Singapore and gets himself to the White House for round two.
Well, there's so much drama as we approach this summit. Mary Jordan, it's always good to have you with us.
Thanks.
And for more on what's at stake at the upcoming summit, I'm joined now by our political analyst, Ron Christie, who served as an advisor to George W. Bush. Ron, so much to talk about. Days to go until the summit in Singapore. Let's start with that. President Trump saying today that he doesn't think he has to prepare that much. It's all about attitude. Now, if you were working in the White House today, what would you make of that statement?
Well, I would laugh and say that the president was making a joke. I can remember all the bilateral meetings that President Bush had, and we would plan these weeks, if not months, in advance. So the notion that a president of the United States can go over and talk with the North Korean leader about so many sensitive issues without preparation, I think, is a little bit on the bravado side.
And let's just look at the diary, of course, because tomorrow is the G7 summit. President Trump will head to Quebec. We're not just talking about one summit that he's prepared for, but we've also got tomorrow.
We've got tomorrow, and we have the President of the United States going with 6 other nations who are very upset with him. The President, by taking actions on tariffs against Canada, against Mexico, and against some of our allies, has these foreign leaders very concerned about the direction of American leadership. So the President better be hitting the books tonight, Rajini, because he's got a lot to prepare for to deal with the folks in Quebec tomorrow, as well as in Singapore next week.
Hitting the books, but that's not necessarily his style, is it?
No, it's not. From my understanding, the president likes being briefed by staff. He likes having pictures. He likes having graphs. But I can tell you from having worked for President Bush, look, there's a lot of preparation that goes into this. The State Department, of course, his National Security Council, so many key advisors that have so much information to share with the president, it would help him if he hit the books. How about that?
You talk about advisors. One voice that we've heard a lot about when it comes to North Korea is, of course, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Now, today, he responded to comments that we heard from the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who said that Kim Jong-un got on his hands and knees and begged for the summit to be back on. And what we heard from Mike Pompeo today was that that isn't the voice of the administration. What is the voice of the administration? We've had John Bolton as well being sidelined as well for his comments on the North Korean issue. Who's speaking on this?
Well, the most senior member of the president's cabinet, of course, is the Secretary of State. This was the job first held by Thomas Jefferson back in 1789. So you would think that the chief diplomat for the president of the United States would be the chief voice speaking on behalf of the government. But then you have Rudy Giuliani, you have Ambassador Bolton, this is the national security advisor. You have too many people, Rajini, who are speaking for the president when the president needs to have clarity and precision, and we're not seeing that this week, heading into 2 very important summits.
And just briefly, Ron, President Trump saying there today that if the summit goes well, Kim Jong-un could come to Washington. What did you make of that?
I thought that was breathtaking. Look, let's take one step at a time. Let's see if we can come to some sort of understanding. Let's see if we can have a small agreement. Then we can talk about normalization of relations and having them here. But we still have many, many days and many more mountains to cover.
And this is, of course, part of a process as well. So President Trump perhaps downplaying his expectations. Do you think now he's saying it could be one of a number of meetings this summit?
Actually, I think that's one of the wiser things he's done this week is to lower the expectations of him on this very important summit. If you lower the bar and you lower expectations, should he be able, in fact, to come to some major agreement, then people will say, look how smart he is and look how well he performed.
Well, Ron, we've just got days to go. Let's see if that summit does indeed happen.
Good to see him.
Well, as we mentioned, President Trump soon departs for the G7 summit in Quebec, where there might not be the most welcoming audience awaiting him. After pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, and then imposing tariffs, America First policies aren't going down so well with other foreign leaders. For more on what to expect, my colleagues Katty Kay and Christian Fraser spoke with Mohammed Al-Arian, Chief Economic Advisor for Alliance, on their programme Beyond 100 Days.
I suspect you'll see 6 of the 7 G7 members tell him that tariffs are not helpful. And I suspect that he will pivot and say, look, why don't you do something to promote your own economic growth? So there may be 2 different narratives coming out. One, pressure on the U.S. on trade, but the other, the U.S. saying to the other countries, well, why don't you do your homework before you come to me and complain about what I'm doing?
Mohammed, you've been watching G7 meetings for many years. Can you remember a time when the world's biggest industrialized democracies were so clearly set against the biggest economy in the world, the United States, as they are at the moment?
No, this is new, and it shows you that the U.S. has decided to take a different approach to a goal that all the G7 shares. So the G7 agrees that you need fairer trade, that something has to be done about theft of intellectual property, that something has to be done about non-tariff trades, that something has to be done to modernize trade agreements. But in the past, this was played in what economists call a cooperative game. You solve it cooperatively. Here, there's a different approach. The U.S. has taken a different negotiating approach. And I think that that is shocking the G7.
Mohammed, the last time you were on the programme, we were talking about growth and confidence returning. But I wonder if suddenly things are looking a little more shaky. We've got tariffs, we've got Brexit, Italy, there's a growth concern now in China. Do you think the world picture is looking a little more wobbly?
Yes, if you remember, I've been cautioning people not to get too excited about the so-called synchronized pickup in global growth, because it was due to a confluence of lucky factors. It wasn't policy-driven, except in the US. In Europe, it was a natural healing process. Think of a patient coming out of hospital. They're no longer in a bed. They can walk, but if they're structurally impaired, as Europe is, they cannot run. In many emerging economies, it's simply a bounce back from a specific shock. Demonetization in India, politics in Brazil. These things don't last. So what we're seeing today is that the so-called synchronized pickup in global growth has a lot less momentum to it. And the message is very clear, and it's an important one for the G7. You need progress on pro-growth policies.
Ultimately, though, is it trust that is the problem here? Because the rise of populism around the world, which is undermining this growth, comes down to trust, doesn't it? A lack of trust in the established order, a lack of trust in bankers, in experts. Is it that is really underpinning the problems that we're seeing around the world?
You're absolutely right. The lack of trust in so many things, in institutions, in the economy, in the establishment, is a very important part of the explanation. But then there's the question, why do we have this lack of trust? And there's a very simple answer. You simply cannot run advanced economies at low growth, and you cannot have the benefits of that growth go to a very small segment of the population without things breaking. And what has broken is trust. So yes, trust is a big issue, but behind that, it's the need to grow at a higher and more inclusive rate.
In other news from around the world, a Swedish court sentenced a failed asylum seeker from Uzbekistan to life in prison for killing 5 people with a stolen truck in central Stockholm last year. A further 10 people were injured when Rakhmat Akilov drove into them. The court said the attack was an act of terrorism. The British government faces mounting pressure from campaigners to reform Northern Ireland's strict abortion law after a majority of Supreme Court judges said it was incompatible with European human rights legislation. But the court said it has no power to declare that the law should be changed. The legendary British nightclub owner Peter Stringfellow has died at the age of 77. He'd been suffering from lung cancer. Known for his flamboyant personality and forthright opinions, he opened a string of clubs in London, Paris, New York, Miami and Beverly Hills, attracting A-list stars to his venues, including the Beatles. Microplastics are reaching the most remote waters of the world, and pollution in the air is contaminating even the freshest snow in Antarctica. Those are the conclusions of a Greenpeace survey gathered during a 3-month expedition earlier this year. The BBC's Claire Marshall was on board the ship when the trawling and testing began and sent us this report.
This is the most remote continent on Earth. It looks pristine, but today there's new evidence that microplastics are now reaching even these waters. And perhaps more disturbingly, there is also pollution from airborne chemicals in freshly fallen snow.
We'll put it over the side.
We were with scientists on board a Greenpeace ship in January as they began testing waters off the Antarctic Peninsula. Very little data exists. It's a question of picking a tiny bit of the Southern Ocean and lowering in a manta, a trawling device. Any microplastics should find their way into the net. The team searched some of the most isolated places on the planet.
This is Hope Bay. It's off the cruise ship trail and not much fishing happens nearby. You won't really see plastic washed ashore. But scientists are worried what may happen here in the future.
We're going to take these 3 samples. These are the snow sampling bottles.
They also hunted for pollution on land, gathering samples of freshly fallen snow. We didn't know it at the time, but even here, deposited either as a gas or in dust were molecules of man-made chemicals. The samples of the 3-month-long expedition were brought to this laboratory in Exeter. The majority were found to be contaminated.
What we're finding is that in almost all of the samples of water we collected, we find tiny pieces of microplastics. Maybe only a few fragments or fibres in every litre of water, but given that this is really the end of the Earth, it's remarkable once again that we're finding microplastics almost wherever we look.
Jason Roberts has worked in the polar regions for more than 30 years.
What's the worst thing you've ever seen?
I've seen some quite terrible things with plastics, but it's all on the bigger scale. What actually is probably more terrible is the smaller scale, the microplastics you can't see, but the things you can see. I've seen once on a sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia, a fur seal with a fishing net around it, which been caught in it for quite a long time because the net had grown into the skin and into the blubber.
This will only add to the growing calls for something to be done about plastic before more of it reaches the end of the Earth. Claire Marshall, BBC News, Antarctica.
You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme, is President Trump's foreign policy a hit or miss with those who voted for him? We go to the baseball field to find out. Russian President Vladimir Putin's been answering questions in his annual televised phone-in. Speaking about international sanctions on Russia, Mr. Putin said the West was using the wrong approach. Steve Rosenberg was watching.
This is always an extraordinary TV spectacle, a marathon live phone-in designed to portray President Putin as a cross between Father of the Nation and Father Christmas, with a dash of Wizard of Oz thrown in. In other words, to create the image of a modern-day magical czar who will solve your problems. Caller. Alexei asked the president to do something about rising fuel prices. Immediately, the Kremlin leader got the energy minister on the line to discuss the issue. Then, residents of a little town complained that their local hospital was facing closure. Putin ordered the local governor to get on the case. And then, a family asked President Putin to rewrite government rules and regulations about mortgages. The president agreed, just like that.
Well, in just over a week's time, the World Cup will kick off in Russia, and the host country's keen to prove they're not hostile, just misunderstood. Welcome banners are up in cities where games are taking place, but when the BBC visited the city of Nizhny Novgorod, it saw that there's a paranoid part of Russia still at play. Sarah Rainsford sent us this report.
There is a striking new landmark on the River Volga. Nizhny Novgorod, out of bounds for foreigners in Soviet times, is now in a final push to impress visitors for the World Cup. Inside Nizhny's very own Kremlin, so are its politicians.
I think the atmosphere here is great, and our relations with all countries are very friendly.
Welcome to Nizhny Novgorod region. We wait you.
And this one's 392.
But this was the welcome that awaited us.
The whole time we've been here in Nizhny, it seems there's been somebody following us, at least one car, sometimes three. And I think there's one of them that's been with us on our tail the whole day, right behind now.
We realised we had company wherever we went. Even to interview players at the local football club, excited they'll be moving from this ground to the city's new stadium after the World Cup. And minutes after we met local opposition activists, there was this. The pair at the door said they'd come from state television to interview us, but we hadn't told anyone we'd be here. This group support President Putin's biggest critic, Alexei Navalny. And some here tell me a country that regularly detains political opponents doesn't deserve to host the World Cup.
I'm very upset about the position of other countries towards Putin and towards the people with whom he surrounded himself.
You wish the world had stayed away?
Yes, definitely, yes.
The next day, we were followed again to the flat where the Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov was sent into exile. The guide says it was to keep him from the foreign press ahead of the 1980 Olympics. The KGB kept close watch on Sakharov from next door. 4 decades on, our own watchers lurked outside. All this in a country that insists it's not hostile, only misunderstood.
Russia wants to use this World Cup to show its best face to the world. And yet there is another side to life here that perhaps those visitors won't see.
It is the increasingly paranoid, controlling side that's clearly there behind the makeover for the World Cup. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Nizhny Novgorod.
Now, over the past few weeks, we've heard endlessly from politicians and pundits about the Trump administration's foreign policy. But what do voters think, especially those who put him in the White House? Well, the BBC's Neda Tawfik's been to a baseball game in Pennsylvania to find out.
President Trump has turned American foreign policy into something of a must-watch sporting event. Look away too long and risk missing an important play. Pennsylvania was one of the key states that swung the election, and here his loyal base approves of his strong-arm tactics. We asked his supporters at the Fighting Phils game to grade his diplomacy so far. Susan likes President Trump's unpredictability.
The hardcore, rough face that he's had comes out. There's no question about that. But I think it's somewhat refreshing and no one is expecting it.
Critics of this administration believe the world is less safe now that the United States has pulled out of the Iran deal, the Paris Climate Accord, and has provoked a trade war. But they have been unable to discredit President Trump in the eyes of his supporters. From Iran,
they probably already have nuclear weapons. We gave them all that money, skids of money, and what did we get out of it? Nothing.
To imposing tariffs on allies.
I realize what they could do to us. We might have to pay for that, but It has to be done to keep the country safe. I'm all for keeping the country safe.
And they reject the notion that these actions will leave the U.S. increasingly isolated.
America will never be alone. The billions of dollars that people come to us for aid and help, we're never going to be alone.
In fact, the upcoming U.S.-North Korea summit is further proof to them that America is winning.
He's going to do what he thinks is right. You know, he's not going to kowtow to anybody. You know?
And do you think he's going to be able to make a deal on North Korea?
Maybe, maybe not, but at least he's trying something. What we've done in the past hasn't worked.
We also asked those who didn't vote for President Trump to grade his foreign relations. They were less generous.
His ego and everything gets in the way of his decisions.
I don't like his policies. I think he's antagonistic.
I don't know how anybody can take anything that comes out of his mouth seriously, because tomorrow it'll be something different.
In baseball, they say attitude is everything. And that's also President Trump's guiding principle in foreign policy, to project American strength. And while his unconventional approach is often criticized, with his base, it's a hit.